He spent $70 on a mystery box and thought he'd been scammed. But inside that rusted container, buried beneath trash and rot, was a glass bottle and a letter from a dying father begging someone to save his missing daughter. That night, a Navy SEAL on leave and his loyal dog stepped into a storm that would uncover murder, betrayal, and a miracle only God could design. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. The wind swept down from the Cascade Mountains, carrying with it the sharp scent of pine and the cold bite of Oregon's winter. Snow lay heavy across the valley outside Bend, blanketing the world in white silence. Inside a roadside auction lot, under the dull hum of fluorescent lights, a man named Ethan Cole stood watching a rusted metal container being pried open. Ethan was 36, tall and broad-shouldered, his frame honed by years of Navy SEAL discipline. His face carried the calm ruggedness of a soldier long accustomed to storms. Short, dark hair streaked faintly with gray, a shadow of beard over a strong jaw, and eyes the color of cold steel. There was a quiet war behind those eyes, one that hadn't ended when his service did. He was supposed to be on leave, the polite phrase the Navy used when they gave you time to learn how to be normal again. But Ethan had never been normal. He carried ghosts the way others carried scars, silent, deep, and always just beneath the skin. At his side sat Shadow, a 7-year-old German shepherd, thick-furred and intelligent, his coat a blend of ash gray and black that shimmered under the white glow. Shadow had served with Ethan during operations overseas. The dog had seen the same darkness, heard the same explosions, felt the same chaos, and somehow survived it with a heart still capable of love. Shadow was more than a companion. He was the last remnant of Ethan's unit, the last breathing link to a world that had burned itself out. Ethan's hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his worn field jacket as the auctioneer shouted over the wind, "Container B-17, mystery prize, one lucky draw." The man's voice was hoarse, his cheeks raw from the cold. Around Ethan, a handful of bidders in thick jackets stamped their boots against the ice. They looked at him curiously, a newcomer with the posture of command but the eyes of a drifter. He didn't fit among them, yet he didn't seem to care. He wasn't here for treasure. He was here because he had $70 left, and he needed to feel something that wasn't regret. When the auctioneer pointed at him and said, "Sold, $70 to the man with the dog," Ethan just nodded. Shadow wagged his tail once, as if congratulating him on some invisible victory. The container groaned open with a rusty protest. A wave of foul air spilled out, mold, rot, and something faintly chemical. The onlookers grimaced and moved away. Ethan, however, just stared. Inside, under the harsh white light, was nothing but junk. Cracked plastic bins, torn cardboard, waterlogged cushions, and a sagging sofa that smelled like rain and mildew. He exhaled, half laughing, half cursing under his breath. "Well, Shadow," he said, "we just bought a dumpster." The dog tilted his head, amber eyes gleaming with curiosity. Ethan climbed inside, boots crunching over broken glass. It was a graveyard of forgotten things. He rifled through a few boxes. Old newspapers, rusted utensils, a child's torn shoe, and felt the same dull emptiness that had shadowed him since leaving the Navy. Back then, he had believed in missions, in purpose, in the idea that every risk meant something. Now, he couldn't even find meaning in a sealed box. He sat down on the cold metal floor, his breath fogging in the air, and pulled off his gloves. His hands were rough, the knuckles scarred from training and fights long buried in memory. $70 for silence, he muttered. Maybe that's worth something. Shadow sniffed around the corners of the container, tail low, nose twitching. Suddenly, the dog stopped and pawed at a stack of damp cardboard near the back. A faint clink echoed like the glass tapping metal. "What is it, boy?" Ethan asked, pushing himself up. Shadow scratched harder, whining softly. Beneath the layers of wet paper and old rags, Ethan's fingers found a small object, cold, smooth, and cylindrical. He pulled it free. It was a glass bottle, sealed tight with a rusted cap and half covered in dried mud. Inside, through the cloudy surface, he could see something. Folded paper, yellowed with age. For a brief second, Ethan felt the familiar prickle of adrenaline, that tiny spark his body still remembered from missions gone wrong. He laughed at himself. What's next? A pirate map. Still, curiosity won. He fetched a multi-tool from his belt and pried off the cap. The smell of damp paper drifted out. Carefully, he slid the rolled sheet free and uncurled it beneath the weak light of his flashlight. The writing was smeared but legible, scrawled in desperate, uneven strokes. To whoever finds this, my name is Henry Lawson. If you read these words, I am already dead. They killed me for what I refused to sign. My daughter Lily, please, if she's still alive, save her. They will tell you she's fine, but they lie. They will bury her like they buried me. Whoever you are, please find her before they do. Ethan stared at the note, reading it again and again until the words blurred. Somewhere behind him, the wind moaned through the half-open door. For a moment, it felt like the ghosts of his past had found him in this container of trash. Voices of men who had once called him brother, begging for help that came too late. He tried to shake it off. "It's a prank," he said aloud, though his voice lacked conviction. He folded the paper, slipped it into his pocket, and whistled to Shadow. "Let's go. Enough fairy tales for one night." But when dawn came and the pale sun crept across the snow, Ethan returned to the container. He told himself it was just to clean it out, to salvage scrap he could sell. Yet as he dug through the soggy remains, he found more. Photographs, warped from water, but still visible. A smiling man with a young girl on his shoulders, a woman in a red scarf. A family, frozen in time. He found a silver bracelet small enough for a child's wrist, engraved with 2 letters, L.A. He found drawings, crayon sketches of a house by a lake, of a man and a little girl holding hands. Ethan sat back on his heels, the bracelet cold in his gloved palm. He thought of his own father, gone before Ethan had turned 10, leaving behind a quiet mother who raised him on faith and discipline. He remembered the day he enlisted, the pride in her eyes when she said, "Be the man your father wanted you to be." That had been years ago, before wars, before blood, before the silence. He looked at the photos again. The girl's smile reminded him of something he had lost, the innocence of believing the world could still be fixed. "Shadow," he said quietly, "what if it's real?" The dog's ears perked. His amber eyes met Ethan's, patient, questioning. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, uncertain whether to laugh or pray. Snow fell in slow spirals outside, catching the pale light like ashes. He pocketed the bracelet, folded the photographs, and took one last look around the container. Somewhere deep inside, the dormant soldier stirred, the one who couldn't walk away from a call for help. Ethan closed the container door and locked it behind him. "Come on, boy," he said softly. "We've got a message to follow." Shadow trotted beside him, tail swaying low, their footprints soon swallowed by the endless white. Above them, the Oregon sky was iron gray, and the wind whispered through the pines like the faint echo of fate itself beginning to turn its wheel. Snow still covered the small town of Bend like a soft shroud, muffling every sound, hiding sins and secrets beneath its frozen calm. The morning after Ethan Cole found the bottle, the world felt different, sharper, as if the air itself was waiting for something to happen. He hadn't slept. The note haunted him, the name Henry Lawson echoing in his head like a radio signal that refused to die. Ethan sat inside the small cabin he rented, a wooden structure on the edge of the pine forest, once part of an old ranger station. The walls smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. His coffee had gone cold in his hand, untouched. Shadow lay near the door, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. The dog's ears twitched every few seconds, tracking the crackle of the fire. On the table in front of Ethan lay the items he had gathered from the container, the letter, the bracelet, and the photographs. He turned the bracelet over in his hand. The engraving, L.A., was delicate, probably a child's first jewelry. He thought of the girl in the photo again, Lily Lawson, maybe 7 or 8, with a wide grin and hair like sunlight caught in motion. There was something innocent in her eyes that hurt to look at, like the memory of a world he no longer belonged to. He unrolled the letter again, tracing the lines written in desperation. "They killed me for what I refused to sign." The words clung to him. Killed by whom? For what? Ethan didn't believe in fate, but he did believe in cause and effect. And this letter, this fragment of a stranger's last breath, had found him for a reason. A knock at the door pulled him back. Shadow raised his head, ears pointed. Ethan slid the letter under a magazine and opened the door cautiously. On the porch stood Mrs. Dalton, the cabin's owner. She was a woman in her late 50s, sturdy and practical, with short salt and pepper hair and a face shaped by years of wind and work. She wore a heavy wool coat and carried a small basket of bread wrapped in a towel. Her kindness was plain, but so was the curiosity in her pale blue eyes. "Morning, Mr. Cole," she said, her voice brisk. "You planning on staying much longer? Weather's turning bad again. Forecast says we'll get another storm by nightfall." "I'll be here a few more days," Ethan replied. "Just taking some quiet time." Mrs. Dalton nodded, her gaze drifting toward the table inside. "You know that old storage auction? Folks say those containers were cleared out from properties foreclosed years ago. Never know what kind of trouble people leave behind. You be careful with what you bring home." Ethan gave a polite smile. "I'll keep that in mind." When she left, Shadow padded over and nudged the door shut with his nose. The dog looked up at Ethan as if to say, "She's right. You're stepping into something you shouldn't." Ethan poured the cold coffee into the sink, then glanced at the photographs again. One picture caught his attention this time, a blurred background of a house, big and old, framed by snow-laden pines. The kind of property that screamed money and legacy. Scribbled on the back, in faded ink, were the words, "Lawson Estate, Crescent Lake." "Crescent Lake?" Ethan murmured. He grabbed his laptop, the old kind with scratches across the lid, and started searching. There it was. Crescent Lake, Oregon, population barely 300. He scrolled through real estate records until one name made his pulse quicken. Richard Lawson, listed as the current owner of the Lawson estate. Same last name. He sat back in the chair. So Henry Lawson had been the original owner, and Richard was his brother? The letter's accusation, "They killed me for what I refused to sign," began to take shape. Ethan didn't believe in coincidence. He believed in patterns. And this one was too deliberate to ignore. That night, the storm arrived like an army. Wind howled through the trees. Snow slashed sideways across the cabin windows. Ethan sat by the fire, map spread across his knees. Crescent Lake was 2 hours away, maybe 3 in the snow. He didn't know what he was walking into, but the thought of the girl, Lily, kept him steady. He'd seen too many innocents destroyed by the silence of others. Maybe this was his penance. He rose and began preparing like it was a mission. The movements came back to him naturally, packing survival gear, checking his Glock, refilling the fuel canister, securing the rope and flashlight. Shadow watched every motion, tail still, eyes alert. "Yeah, I know," Ethan muttered. "It's insane." He knelt to rub the dog's head. But if that girl's out there, we're not sitting this one out. Before dawn, the storm eased. The forest shimmered under moonlight, each tree cloaked in silver. Ethan loaded his truck, Shadow jumping into the passenger seat like a soldier taking position. The road out of Bend was narrow and half buried under snowdrifts. Hours passed in silence, the only sound the hum of tires and the faint rattle of the heater. When the first sign for Crescent Lake, 5 miles, appeared, the sky was just turning gray. The town was a cluster of weather-beaten houses, a gas station, and a diner with a flickering neon sign that read Martha's Place. Ethan parked in front of it. Inside, the warmth was almost shocking. The air smelled of coffee, bacon, and wood polish. The waitress, Martha Green, was a woman in her early 40s, tall and lean, with auburn hair tied in a messy bun and a kindness that didn't quite hide the weariness in her green eyes. She looked like someone who had once been beautiful in a louder world, but time and loss had softened her brightness into something gentler. "What can I get you, stranger?" she asked with a wry smile, handing him a menu that had seen better days. "Just coffee," Ethan said, removing his gloves, "and some information." Martha arched a brow. "Depends on the kind. Ever heard of the Lawson estate?" Her hand froze mid-wipe on the counter. "That old place by the North Woods? You don't want to go poking around there. Belonged to Henry Lawson before the accident. His brother Richard runs it now. Stays out there with staff. Folks don't see much of them." "Accident," Ethan repeated. Martha leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Gas leak, they said. But Henry was smart, careful. Didn't seem like the kind to leave a stove running. Some folks whisper it wasn't an accident at all." Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "You ever meet Richard?" "Once," she said, frowning. "Came into town after Henry's death. Sharp suit, slick smile. The kind of man who looks at you and already knows what you're worth." She hesitated, then added, "He brought a girl once. Pretty thing, quiet, maybe 10 years old. Never saw her again." "Her name wouldn't happen to be Lily, would it?" Ethan asked. Martha's brow furrowed. "I think so. Why? Who are you?" He took a sip of the coffee, now bitter on his tongue. "Just someone who might be too late." Outside, Shadow barked sharply, his voice echoing through the snow. Ethan turned toward the window. A black SUV had just pulled into the lot. Its windows were tinted, engine still running. Two men sat inside, their silhouettes motionless. Ethan's instincts screamed. He set the mug down quietly and stood. "Thanks for the coffee," he said softly to Martha, slipping a few bills on the counter. "If anyone asks, you didn't see me." She blinked, confused, but nodded. Ethan stepped outside, snow crunching under his boots. The SUV's engine revved once, then fell silent. The men didn't move. Shadow stood rigid beside him, growling low. The winter air felt like glass, thin, sharp, about to shatter. Ethan met the darkened windshield, every muscle tensed. Whoever was inside wasn't random. They were waiting, and somehow they already knew his name. The road to Crescent Lake twisted through dense pine forest, where branches sagged under snow and mist drifted low across the ground like ghostly breath. Ethan Cole drove with headlights off, trusting the moon's silver reflection on the road. The black SUV that had shattered him was gone, or at least hidden well enough to unsettle him. Shadow sat quietly in the passenger seat, head raised, amber eyes flicking between the trees. Ethan's jaw was tight. "Keep watch, boy," he murmured. "Something tells me we're not alone." By the time they reached the outskirts of Crescent Lake's north woods, dawn had only begun to burn through the haze. There it was, the Lawson estate. It rose like a relic from another century, a massive mansion built of weathered stone and red brick, surrounded by an iron fence half buried in snow. The front gates hung askew, creaking softly in the wind. Vines, frozen stiff, crawled up the sides of the house like veins turned to ice. A carved plaque over the arch still read Lawson House, 1892. Ethan parked the truck behind a fallen pine and surveyed the grounds through binoculars. The main house had 3 floors, a veranda, and a rear extension that looked newer, maybe where staff once lived. Lights burned dimly behind drawn curtains. Somewhere inside that house, if the letter was true, a girl named Lily Lawson might still be alive. A movement near the porch caught his eye. A man in a gray coat carrying a shovel walking toward the side garden. He was tall, barrel-chested, with a scruffy beard and a worn face that looked carved from a granite. Gus, Ethan thought, or someone like him, the kind of hired hand who'd do anything for a paycheck. The man's movements were slow, deliberate, and his breath steamed in the cold like smoke from a dying fire. Ethan studied his pattern, walked 10 yards, shovel snow, light a cigarette, scan the yard. Military precision or paranoia. Either way, this place was guarded. He waited until the man disappeared behind the greenhouse, then whispered to Shadow, "Stay close." They slipped through a gap in the fence and moved along the tree line. Snow muffled their footsteps. The air smelled faintly of kerosene and damp earth. Near the back of the estate, Ethan found an old maintenance shed. The door hung crooked, padlock broken. Inside, tools were scattered, rakes, oil cans, even a faded lawnmower. A dusty cap with the Lawson insignia lay on the bench. He grabbed it, brushed it off, and pulled it on. "Looks like I work here now," he muttered. Shadow's tail wagged once, approving the disguise. They crossed the yard and reached the rear entrance, where a service door led into a narrow corridor lined with old paintings. The air inside was warmer, filled with the faint hum of a furnace. Ethan's boots sank into thick carpet. He walked carefully, listening. Distant footsteps, the faint clink of dishes, the low hum of a woman's voice singing softly. Following the sound, he peeked around a corner and saw Clara, the housekeeper. She was in her late 40s, small and round-faced, her silver hair tied into a bun under a lace cap. Her cheeks were flushed from work, but her eyes, pale gray, sharp as knives, betrayed a kind of quiet intelligence. She moved with nervous precision, polishing a vase that already gleamed, humming a tune that trembled at the edges. She didn't see Ethan. He backed away silently and continued deeper into the hall. The mansion's grandeur was decayed but still hauntingly beautiful. Mahogany staircases, crystal chandeliers dimmed by dust, portraits of grim men staring down from the walls. In one room, a grand piano sat under a sheet. A child's drawing was pinned to the music stand, a house, a lake, and a dog. The crayon strokes were clumsy, but full of life. Lily's work, Ethan realized. He moved on until he reached the far corridor. A heavy wooden door stood at the end, its handle secured by a chain and padlock. He crouched, examining the lock. Fresh scratches. Someone had tried to open it recently. Behind the door came a sound so soft he almost missed it, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails on wood. Shadow's ears perked. Ethan's pulse quickened. He took out a small pick set from his coat, working the lock with the focus of habit. After a moment, it clicked open. He eased the chain aside and pushed the door inward. The room was dim, the only light seeping through a high window covered by frost. A thin mattress lay on the floor, a threadbare blanket folded neatly atop it. And there, sitting cross-legged near the window, was a girl. Lily Lawson couldn't have been more than 10. She was pale, almost translucent, her blonde hair tangled around her small shoulders. She wore a faded blue sweater and held a pencil stub in one hand, her wide hazel eyes fixed on Ethan in silent disbelief. "It's okay," he whispered, lowering himself to one knee. "My name's Ethan. Your father sent me." For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then her lip trembled. "Daddy's dead," she said, voice fragile. "Uncle Richard said it was an accident." Ethan nodded slowly. "I know, but your dad left me something that proves he was right. I'm here to help you." Shadow padded forward, tail low. The girl's eyes softened when she saw the dog. She reached out hesitantly. "What's his name?" "Shadow," Ethan said. "He's a good listener." Lily smiled faintly, the first crack in her wall of fear. "Uncle Richard doesn't like dogs," she whispered. "Smart dog, then," Ethan murmured. He scanned the small room. Empty plates, an untouched glass of milk, a single lamp with a broken switch. Someone was keeping her locked away, hidden, but alive. He took out his phone, snapping a quick picture of the room, the girl, the door. "We'll get you out," he promised. "Careful what you promise," a voice drawled from behind. Ethan spun, instinctively moving in, front of Lily. A man leaned casually against the doorframe, a tall figure in a tailored wool coat, his face clean-shaven and handsome in a sharp, predatory way. His hair was dark, slicked back with precision, his eyes pale blue and glacial. Richard Lawson. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well," Richard said smoothly, stepping into the room, "a trespasser pretending to be a hero. How quaint." Ethan's muscles coiled. "You've been keeping her locked in here." Richard laughed lightly, the sound brittle. "Don't be dramatic. She's unwell. Grief does strange things to a child. I'm protecting her from herself, and from people like you." Shadow growled, low and deep. Richard's gaze flicked to the dog, then back to Ethan. "You should leave before I call the sheriff. This is private property." Ethan didn't move. "I don't think the sheriff's the kind of man you call. You prefer quieter solutions." Something flickered in Richard's expression. Annoyance, quickly masked. "I'll overlook this once," he said softly. "Take your dog and go back to whatever ditch you crawled out of. The Lawson affairs are not yours to meddle in." Ethan stepped forward, voice even. "You're right. They were Henry's, and I think you took them from him." Richard's smile vanished. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. "You have no idea what you're walking into," he said, his voice dropping to a hiss. "And when you realize it, it'll be far too late." He turned, coat swirling, and strode down the hall. Clara appeared briefly at the far end, pale and shaken, clutching a tray. Richard's voice snapped, "Keep the girl in her room. I'll deal with our guest." As his footsteps faded, Ethan knelt beside Lily again. "Pack what you can. We're coming back tonight," he whispered. Lily nodded, clutching Shadow's fur like a lifeline. When Ethan slipped out into the frozen air, the first snowflakes of evening began to fall again. The mansion loomed behind him like a living thing, its windows glowing faintly in the dark. Somewhere inside, Richard Lawson was making a call. Somewhere outside, a black SUV idled at the end of the drive, headlights dimmed. Ethan didn't notice it yet, but the men inside were waiting for him to come back. Night had fallen over Crescent Lake like a dark sheet of glass. The sky was clear, but the cold was merciless, the kind that carved through fabric and skin. Ethan Cole crouched near the tree line overlooking the Lawson estate, binoculars in hand, watching faint lights move behind the mansion's frosted windows. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the sound of chains rattling somewhere in the yard. Shadow sat beside him, breath steaming in the air, silent as a ghost. It had been hours since Richard Lawson's warning, yet Ethan knew the man would not wait idly. Men like him didn't bluff. They calculated. Ethan had spent enough years tracking cartel warlords and corrupt officers to recognize the same quiet arrogance in Richard's tone. He was the kind who smiled while loading the gun. "Stay sharp, buddy," Ethan murmured, adjusting his gloves. The plan was simple: get in, extract Lily, and leave before anyone noticed. But plans rarely survived contact with monsters. A crunch of snow startled him. A shadow moved behind the pines. He froze, hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. Out stepped Mac Heller, a man in his early 50s, tall and wiry, wrapped in a heavy hunting jacket with patches on the elbows. His beard was streaked with gray, and his left eye had the faint, milky haze of an old injury. Ethan remembered him vaguely from the diner, a man who'd been sitting in the corner pretending to read a newspaper. "Easy," Mac said, raising his hands. His voice was low, calm, carrying the rasp of years breathing a mountain air. "I figured you'd be back here tonight." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "You following me?" "Following Richard Lawson," Mac corrected, stepping closer. "Name's Heller. Used to be sheriff around here, before Richard's money started buying justice. I've been watching that place for months. You're not the first man who tried to get close." The ex-sheriff's face was carved with fatigue, but his gaze was steady. "I know that girl's in there. I also know what happens to people who ask too many questions. You planning to get her out?" Ethan gave a slight nod. "You got proof?" Heller smirked, pulling a crumpled envelope from his pocket. Inside were photographs, property deeds, hospital files, and what looked like a coroner's report. "Proof enough that Henry Lawson didn't die in any gas leak. His lungs were full of lake water, not smoke, drowned before the explosion. I was pulled off the case before I could speak." Ethan scanned the documents under his flashlight, jaw tightening. Then he staged it all. The explosion was to cover up a murder. Exactly. And that girl, she's the last thread connecting him to the truth. Heller's voice dropped. You don't have long, son. I spotted 2 new trucks on the property this afternoon. Black SUVs, outsiders. My guess? He's moving her tonight. Ethan turned toward the mansion, eyes narrowing. Then we move. First, they crossed the snow, keeping low. The rear gate was half buried, the lock easy to pry open. Inside the yard, the air felt heavier, tainted by diesel and something metallic. The estate slept behind drawn curtains, its silence unnatural. Ethan motioned to Shadow, who slipped ahead, muzzle close to the ground. At the back of the house, a narrow service door stood ajar. Ethan pushed it open quietly and motioned Heller inside. The hallway beyond was dimly lit by a flickering bulb. The scent of polish and smoke lingered. Somewhere upstairs a piano played faintly, slow, deliberate notes like a lullaby turned cruel. They moved silently through the corridor. Then from the far end a voice called out, deep, gruff. Who's there? It was Gus, the groundskeeper. He appeared from the kitchen doorway, shovel in hand, his eyes narrowing when they met Ethan's. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Ethan lunged forward. The fight was quick and brutal, metal on bone, fists against ribs. Gus swung wildly, but Ethan caught his arm, twisted, and slammed him against the wall. The shovel clattered to the floor. Where is she? Ethan demanded through clenched teeth. Gus spat blood, breathing hard. Upstairs. North wing. Who's with her? Clara, but Richard's expecting you. Before he could finish, a gunshot exploded from the stairwell. Heller dove for cover, returning fire. The bullet missed Ethan by inches, embedding in the wooden frame. 2 men in tactical coats charged down, rifles raised, Richard's hired muscle. Shadow leapt forward, snarling, knocking one man off balance. Ethan fired twice. The second man fell, weapon skidding across the marble floor. Move! Heller shouted. They bolted for the stairs. Shadow beside them, paws thudding silently on carpet. The mansion came alive with chaos, doors slamming, radios crackling. Ethan reached the second floor, heart hammering. He kicked open the door to Lily's room. It was empty. The mattress was overturned, the window wide open. Snow blew inward in soft spirals. On the desk lay a single scrap of paper, scrawled in a shaky hand. They're taking me to the boathouse. Damn it, he muttered. The lake's behind the property, Heller said, reloading. He's going to dump her like her father. They sprinted through the corridor, down the back staircase, and out into the freezing night. The wind had risen, howling through the trees. Ahead, faint lights flickered near the waterline, lanterns and the hum of a motor. Ethan raised his binoculars. Richard Lawson stood on the dock, coat whipping in the wind, shouting orders to 2 men loading crates into a small boat. Beside them, struggling against a man's grip, was Lily. Her blue sweater was stark against the snow. Ethan's vision tunneled. We split, he told Heller. You take the left path. I'll draw them out. Heller nodded once, eyes grim. You sure you want to do this? Ethan gave a half smile. I stopped wanting a long time ago. He circled wide, keeping to the shadows, while Shadow crawled low beside him. When they were within range, Ethan aimed at the lantern post and fired. The shot shattered the glass, plunging the dock into darkness. Shouts erupted. Lily screamed. Richard's voice barked, "Find him!" Gunfire tore through the night. Ethan moved between cover, the rhythm of combat returning to his muscles like an old song. Heller's rifle cracked from the left, dropping one of the guards. The other swung his flashlight wildly. Shadow lunged from the dark, teeth flashing, dragging the man into the snow. Ethan charged forward, grabbing Lily's arm. "You're safe now. Run to the trees. Go!" he shouted. But as he turned, the cold muzzle of a gun pressed against the back of his head. Richard's voice hissed close to his ear. "Heroics don't suit you, Mr. Cole." Ethan froze, breath clouding the air. Richard's hand was steady. "You should have walked away when I offered. Now you'll vanish just like Henry did." Lily's voice broke through the storm. "Please, Uncle, don't." Richard's jaw tightened. "Quiet, girl." He cocked the hammer, and then, from the darkness, a deep growl rose, a sound like thunder from the ground itself. Shadow burst from the snow, hitting Richard square in the chest. The gun fired wild. Ethan twisted, grabbing Richard's wrist, forcing the weapon aside. The shot hit the frozen lake, ricocheting into the night. They struggled, feet slipping on the icy dock. Richard swung a knife, catching Ethan across the shoulder. Pain flared hot and sharp. Ethan gritted his teeth, drove his elbow into Richard's ribs, and knocked him back. The knife fell, clattering into the water. Before Ethan could react, 2 new headlights appeared at the tree line, SUVs, engines roaring, reinforcements. Heller's voice rang out from across the lake. "Ethan, run!" Ethan grabbed Lily's hand, pulling her toward the trees. "Shadow, with me!" The dog obeyed instantly, bounding ahead. Behind them, bullets tore through the snow, splinters flying from the pines. Richard's voice echoed through the storm. "You can't hide forever, Cole. The woods won't save you." They vanished into the forest, the night swallowing them whole. The sound of engines grew louder, closing in. Ethan's shoulder throbbed with pain, but he didn't stop. For the first time since he'd left the Navy, he had something worth dying for. Far behind, on the frozen dock, Richard Lawson stood bleeding in the snow, eyes blazing with fury. He raised his radio to his lips. "Seal the perimeter," he ordered. "Bring them back, alive." The wind howled through the dark pines, carrying the promise of the hunt to come. The forest swallowed sound like a great living beast. Snow fell heavier now, turning the air into a white curtain that blurred shapes and distance. Ethan Cole led the way, his wounded shoulder burning, his breath visible in sharp bursts of steam. Lily's small hand clutched his coat tightly, her steps uneven in the deep snow. Shadow padded beside them, alert and silent, his black-gray fur blending into the shadows. Behind, the distant rumble of engines grew closer, their pursuers fanning out through the trees. They reached a narrow creek, half frozen beneath the ice. Ethan knelt and brushed the snow aside, searching the dark water for direction. "We head north," he whispered. "Follow the stream till it bends west. If we can reach the ranger outpost, we'll have a chance." His voice was calm, but his eyes kept flicking toward the sound of men shouting in the distance. Lily nodded, trembling. "Are they going to catch us?" Ethan forced a small smile. "Not if we keep moving." They waded through knee-deep drifts, the wind cutting through their clothes. Shadow stopped suddenly, ears twitching, then gave a low growl. Ethan froze. Through the swirling snow, a flashlight beam slashed across the dark. A man's voice followed. "Spread out! He's got the girl!" Ethan ducked behind a fallen pine, pulling Lily close. Through the branches, he saw 2 men in tactical jackets move past. One was short and wide, the other tall and thin, his face half hidden by a scarf. They carried suppressed rifles and moved with trained efficiency. Not local thugs. Professionals. Ethan whispered, "Stay here. Don't move until I call." He slipped into the trees, circling behind them. The tall one turned at the faint sound of a twig snapping, but too late. Ethan's arm hooked around his throat, twisting sharply. The man dropped without a sound. The shorter one spun around, gun raised, but Shadow was faster. The dog lunged from the snow, clamping his jaws on the man's forearm. The rifle fired wildly into the night before falling silent. Ethan pressed a finger to his lips, signaling Shadow to release. Lily peeked from behind the log, eyes wide in fear and awe. Ethan crouched beside her. "We're okay, but they'll hear that shot. We have to move." They pushed deeper into the forest. The trees thickened, the snow rising to their knees. Ethan's shoulder throbbed with every step, the wound reopening under the strain. Shadow stayed close, his amber eyes scanning the white void ahead. Then, faint through the wind, came another sound, the rhythmic chug of an engine, slower and heavier than the SUVs. A snowcat, maybe. He cursed under his breath. "He's bringing more men." At the base of a ridge, they found a small wooden cabin half buried under snow. Its chimney was broken, windows dark. Ethan hesitated only a second before forcing the door open. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and rust. There was an old stove, a broken cot, and a few rusted tools scattered on the floor. He motioned Lily inside. "We'll rest here for a minute." Lily sank onto the cot, shivering. Shadow lay at her feet, pressing his warmth against her legs. Ethan tore a strip from his undershirt, cleaning the blood from his shoulder. He worked quickly, his face tight with pain. After a few minutes, Lily whispered, "You're hurt." "I've had worse." He tied the bandage and forced a grin. "Back in training, we used to call this a scratch." She managed a faint smile. "You don't talk like a regular person." He laughed quietly. "That's because I'm not one." Before they could rest longer, a new noise drifted from outside, the crunch of boots in the snow. Ethan doused his flashlight, motioning Lily to silence. He drew his pistol and moved to the window. Through the frosted glass, he saw a man in a thick parka, standing near the creek, scanning the trees with a flashlight. The man's face was sharp, angular, with deep-set eyes and a trimmed mustache. He carried himself with the calm precision of a man who'd spent years giving orders rather than taking them. Ethan recognized him from military briefings long ago. Colt Ramsey, former private security officer turned mercenary contractor, ruthless reputation, the kind of man Richard Lawson would hire for cleanup. Colt's voice carried through the wind. "Fan out! He's bleeding! We'll find him before dawn!" Ethan's mind raced. Colt had once been a SEAL himself, a commander with medals, until a civilian operation overseas went wrong and 3 hostages died. He'd vanished after that, showing up years later in the private sector. Now he was hunting one of his own. Lily whispered, "Who is he?" "Someone who forgot what the uniform meant," Ethan said softly. Colt turned toward the cabin suddenly, his flashlight beam sweeping across the broken window. Ethan ducked. The beam moved on, but not far. Colt's voice sharpened. "Over here! Tracks! Fresh!" Ethan grabbed Lily's hand. "We're leaving!" They slipped out the back door into the storm. Shadow led them uphill, moving fast despite the snow. Gunfire erupted behind them, warning shots at first, then closer. Bark splintered off trees beside them. Lily stumbled. Ethan scooped her up, pushing through the pain in his arm. The ridge rose steeply, ending at a ledge overlooking the frozen valley. Below, the dark mirror of Crescent Lake glimmered faintly through the snow. "Keep your head down," he said, lowering Lily behind a fallen log. Shadow barked once, sharp, urgent. A bullet hit the snow inches from Ethan's boot. Colt's voice came from the darkness. "You can't outrun me, Cole. You're bleeding, and the kid's slowing you down. Hand her over, and maybe I'll let you crawl out of here alive." Ethan looked at Lily, her eyes wide with terror, and felt something in his chest ignite. A defiance born from every man he'd ever failed to save. "You want her?" he shouted back. "Come get her!" He fired 3 shots toward the voice, ducking behind the log as return fire chewed through the bark. Colt's men were closing in, circling from both sides. Then Ethan saw it. The glint of a red fuel can half buried near an old snowmobile. A plan formed instantly. He turned to Lily. "When I say run, you follow Shadow down that trail. Don't stop until you see the ranger station." "What about you?" she whispered. "I'll be right behind you." He gave Shadow a hand signal. The dog growled softly, ready. Ethan crawled to the snowmobile, ripping the fuel line loose. Gasoline splashed across the snow. He struck a flare from his pocket, the flame hissing to life. Colt's voice called again, closer now. "Don't do anything stupid, Cole." Ethan smiled grimly. "Too late for that." He threw the flare. Fire whooshed across the ground, racing toward the trees. The explosion came a second later, a burst of orange that lit the night sky. The shock waved through snow like waves across the ridge. "Run!" Ethan yelled. Lily and Shadow bolted down the trail, vanishing into the storm. Behind them, Colt shouted orders, trying to regroup. Ethan fired one last shot, then turned and followed, blood seeping through his bandage. The forest glowed faintly behind them, flames licking at the sky. They ran until the fire's glow faded, replaced by the cold shimmer of moonlight on snow. Ethan slowed, gasping for breath. Ahead, through the trees, a faint red light blinked. A radio tower beacon. The ranger station. Salvation, maybe. But then came a sound that froze his blood. The deep growl of an engine. Another vehicle, closer than before. Shadow stopped, ears flat, teeth bared. Lily gripped Ethan's arm. "It's them again, isn't it?" Ethan's eyes narrowed toward the lightless road below. "Yeah," he whispered, "and they're not done yet." Far behind them, the fire burned bright against the night, and in its glow Colt Ramsey stood watching, his expression calm and unreadable. He spoke into his radio. "Cole's alive. He's heading north. Tell Richard Lawson to keep the line open. I'll bring them home." The snow swallowed his words as the hunt continued. The snowstorm had dulled into silence, a pale gray light spreading slowly over the forest. Ethan Cole moved carefully through the trees, every muscle stiff from exhaustion and pain. His wounded shoulder burned beneath the frozen fabric of his jacket, but he didn't slow down. The faint, blinking light of the ranger station's radio tower was closer now, less than a mile through the pines. Lily stumbled beside him, her small hand clinging to Shadow's thick fur. The dog's breath steamed in the air as he led them forward, ears twitching at every sound. They reached the clearing as dawn began to bleed into the horizon. The ranger station stood on a rocky rise overlooking Crescent Lake, its roof half buried under snow. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney, but the faint glow of a lantern flickered inside. Ethan motioned for Lily to stay low. "Wait here with Shadow. I'll check it first." He crept toward the door, weapon drawn. The hinges creaked faintly as he pushed it open. Inside was a single room, rusted radio console, overturned chairs, a cot covered in blankets. On the floor lay a man in a ranger's uniform, unconscious but breathing. His name tag read, Tom Reyes. Tom was in his mid-30s, lean with a sun-creased face and a dark stubble that shadowed his jaw. His skin was the color of bronze pine bark, and his uniform, though torn, still carried the insignia of the Oregon Forest Service. Ethan checked his pulse. Steady. The man stirred, groaning softly. Who are you?" "Someone who needs your radio," Ethan replied. "You've got men coming your way, armed and dangerous." Tom blinked, trying to focus. "Lawson's people? You know about them?" He gave a slow nod, rubbing his temples. "They came through last night, asking about a missing girl. Told me to keep my mouth shut. I didn't." He tried to sit up, but winced. "They jumped me when I radioed the county sheriff. I think the call went through before they cut the line." Ethan helped him up. "Good. That means help might be on the way." He glanced out the window. The snow had thinned enough to reveal the long slope leading down to the lake. "We just need to hold until then." Tom's gaze shifted to Lily, who now stood in the doorway with Shadow pressed to her leg. "That's her, isn't it? The Lawson girl." "Yeah," Ethan said quietly. "And the man who killed her father is coming to finish what he started." Tom swallowed hard. "Then we make a stand." He grabbed a rifle from the wall, an old Winchester, but clean. "There's a fuel tank behind the station and a backup generator. If they come through that pass, we can slow them down." Ethan gave a short nod. "Let's get to work." They moved quickly, setting up positions around the cabin. Ethan used snowdrifts for cover, digging shallow trenches to steady their aim. Tom wired the generator to the fuel line, creating a crude but effective ignition trap. The cold bit deep into Ethan's hands as he checked his Glock, counting the remaining rounds. 8 bullets and one last flare. Not much for a war, but enough for a message. By the time they were ready, the first sound came. Engines rumbling in the distance, growing louder, then fading as vehicles slowed near the ridge. Ethan looked through the scope. 2 SUVs, 4 men, and stepping out from the lead vehicle, Colt Ramsey. Colt's dark coat whipped in the wind, his posture calm, confident. He scanned the clearing with the unhurried precision of a predator. "Cole," he called, his voice echoing across the snow, "you're bleeding time. Give me the girl, and you get to walk away breathing." Ethan leaned against the window frame, eyes narrowing. "You've been saying that for hours. Still not convincing." Colt chuckled, the sound low and humorless. "I respected you once, Cole. You knew when to follow orders. What changed?" Ethan's voice hardened. "I stopped following the wrong men." The silence that followed was long and cold. Then Colt raised his hand. "End this." Gunfire erupted, shredding the snow and splintering the wooden walls. Ethan returned fire, the recoil sharp against his injured shoulder. Tom flanked left, firing in controlled bursts. Shadow darted between cover, barking sharply, drawing the shooter's aim away from Lily. One mercenary moved too close to the generator. Ethan fired, hitting the fuel drum beside him. The explosion ripped through the clearing, fire bursting skyward, swallowing one SUV whole. Colt dove behind the other vehicle, snow and flame scattering in all directions. The shockwave knocked Ethan backward. His ears rang, lungs burning from the smoke. He coughed and reloaded, glimpsing Colt through the haze. The man moved like a machine, cold, efficient, unstoppable. "Stay down!" Ethan shouted to Lily, who huddled behind the table with Shadow, guarding her fiercely. Tom yelled from the side window, "2 left, 1 heading for the tower." Ethan spun and fired again, dropping the man climbing the slope, but the second gunman, a burly shape in black, charged toward the door. Before Ethan could react, Shadow lunged, colliding with the man's chest. They crashed into the snow outside, the dog snarling, teeth flashing. A shot went off, then silence. Shadow limped back in, fur matted with blood but eyes bright. Ethan knelt, stroking the dog's neck. "Good boy, hold on." The last sound he expected to hear came next. A helicopter, faint at first, then rising above the treetops. Ethan glanced out the window. "Sheriff's back up," Tom breathed, relief flooding his voice. But then Colt Ramsey stepped into view again, pistol raised, face bloodied but smiling. "You really think this is about survival, Cole? Men like us were built for war. It's the quiet that kills us." Ethan stepped out from the doorway, gun leveled. "Then let's finish the noise." They fired almost simultaneously. Colt's bullet grazed Ethan's arm. Ethan's found its mark dead center. Colt staggered, dropping his weapon, the defiance in his eyes flickering out like a dying ember. He fell backward into the snow, the storm swallowing him. The helicopter hovered overhead now, its searchlight flooding the clearing. Deputies in winter gear poured out, weapons drawn. Tom waved them down, shouting, "They're friendly! Lawson girl's safe!" Lily ran to Ethan, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Is it over?" Ethan looked toward the lake where smoke curled above the trees. "Yeah," he said softly, "it's over." Hours later, as the sun rose fully, the chaos had quieted. Paramedics loaded Shadow onto a stretcher, treating his leg wound. The dog whimpered once, but wagged his tail weakly when Ethan approached. Tom stood beside him, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. "You did good, soldier," he said. Ethan gave a weary smile. "You too, Ranger." From the road below, the sound of another engine approached, an unmarked sedan escorted by a sheriff's vehicle. A tall woman stepped out, her black coat buttoned tight against the cold. Agent Mira Donovan, FBI. She was in her 40s, sharp-featured, with storm-gray eyes and the controlled confidence of someone used to walking into chaos and owning it. "Ethan Cole," she said, offering her badge. "We've been tracking Lawson for months. You just handed us the last piece." Ethan nodded faintly. "I wasn't aiming for glory." Mira's tone softened. "I know, but you saved a child, exposed a murderer, and burned down a fortress of lies. That's more than most men do in a lifetime." He glanced toward Lily, who now sat wrapped in a blanket beside Shadow, petting his head gently. "I just couldn't walk away." Mira smiled slightly. "Good. The world needs men who don't." As the sun climbed higher, the snow glittered like crushed glass, washing the forest in light. Ethan turned his gaze to the horizon, where the fire's smoke still drifted above Crescent Lake. For the first time in years, the ache inside him quieted. He reached down, resting a hand on Shadow's head. "Let's go home, buddy," he said softly. The wind stirred the ashes of the night's battle, carrying them toward the open sky, a promise that even in the coldest places, dawn still comes for those who keep walking toward it. Sometimes God doesn't speak through thunder or miracles written in the sky. He whispers through the quiet loyalty of a dog, the courage of a broken soldier, and the innocence of a child who refuses to give up. Ethan's story isn't just about war or justice. It's about the small, sacred moments where grace appears in the coldest places. A hand reaching out, a life saved, a soul forgiven. Every one of us walks through winters of our own, storms of loss, fear, or doubt. But if this story reminds us of anything, it's that faith isn't about what we see. It's about what we choose to believe when the light fades. Miracles still happen, sometimes in the form of a stranger who stays when everyone else walks away. If this story touched your heart, share it. Leave a comment about where you're watching from, and let us know how God has shown you kindness in your life. And if you believe that faith and courage can still change the world, don't forget to subscribe to our channel to keep these stories of hope, loyalty, and redemption alive. May God bless you, your family, and every weary heart that still believes that love and miracles can rise even after the storm.